Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's discussion with Professor Jonathan Wolff at Trinity College, Dublin. My name is Donna Lyons and I am with School of Law at Trinity College, and this is seminar 20 in our speaker series. So Jonathan Wolff is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy and Governing Body Fellow at Wolfson College. He was formerly Blavatnik Chair in Public Policy at the school, and before that Professor of Philosophy and Dean of Arts and Humanities at UCL. He's currently developing a new research program on revitalising democracy and civil society in accordance with the aims of the Alfred Landecker Professorship. His other current work largely concerns equality, disadvantage, social justice and poverty, as well as applied topics such as public safety, disability, gambling, and the regulation of recreational drugs, which he has discussed in his books, Ethics and Public Policy, a Philosophical Inquiry, Routledge 2011, and we're speaking about the second edition of that today, and his other book, The Human Right to Health, which is with Norton 2012. He has a long-standing interest in health and health promotion, including questions of justice in healthcare resource allocation, the social determinants of health, and incentives and health behaviour. He's been a member of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, the Academy of Medical Science Working Party on Drug Futures, the Gambling Review Body, the Homicide Review Group, an external member of the Board of Science of the British Medical Association, and a trustee of Gamble Aware. He writes a regular column on higher education for The Guardian. So it's a great privilege to speak with you today. We're talking today about the second edition of Ethics and Public Policy, a Philosophical Inquiry, which is published with Routledge. So the second edition subjects important and controversial areas of public policy to philosophical scrutiny. Jonathan Wolff introduces and assesses core problems and controversies in public policy from a philosophical standpoint. Each chapter focuses on important areas of public policy where there's considerable moral and philosophical disagreement, and we're hoping to talk about some of those difficult areas in this discussion. So throughout the book, fundamental questions for both philosopher and policymaker recur. What are the best methods for connecting philosophy and public policy? Should thinking about public policy be guided by an ideal world or the world we live in now? If there are knockdown arguments in philosophy, why are there none in public policy? And some of those methodological questions will be raised by Professor Preda and Dr. Noonan, who will come and join the discussion later on. So I just wanted to start off by asking a question on your first chapter on scientific experimentation on animals. So in that chapter, you talk about animal rights or animal liberation, as it's also noted, and we actually had a discussion with Peter Singer, who you'll know, in September of last year, which is really interesting, and he had a lot to say about this. So I really enjoyed reading that chapter of yours. So in the beginning, you ask, how should human beings treat non-human animals? And that this may well be, from the perspective of the future, the defining question of our age. Will future human beings look back at contemporary practices of eating meat and using animals for scientific experiments with the horror we have for earlier practices of slavery? Indeed, on some views, what we do to animals is far worse than what was at least routinely done to slaves. So you say that it's unlikely that we can come to an accurate view about what future generations will think of us, but we can try to come to a view about what the correct approach to the ethical question of the treatment of animals is. And you say that my main task here, however, is not to argue for any particular answer to that question. Rather, I will attempt to argue that one standard way of approaching the moral question of our treatment of non-human animals is unhelpful, and an alternative framework is much more promising, both philosophically and for policy debates. And I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on that alternative framework that you discuss in chapter 1.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a funny thing having your own words read out to you and thinking, who on earth said that, and why would they have said such a thing? But I think is trying to think my way back into the frame of mind when I first wrote that, so which was probably more than 10 years ago when I was drafting that, and further back when I was thinking directly about questions around animal experimentation for the Nuffield Council. But so this was one of the earlier engagements I had with public policy. And when I started, I had quite high confidence that the things we had done in philosophy, in moral and political philosophy classes, or what I'd learned and what we'd taught, could translate quite easily into practical contexts. And this was one of those areas where I realized that the world is much messier than our seminar room presents it sometimes. And when you actually have to make, not in this case, not decisions, but recommendations that have to have a level of credibility, then some of the approaches we have taken in philosophy are less helpful. So what I mean in this particular case is that one way of thinking about the relation between human beings and animals is to ask, what is it that makes human beings special? So what is it that makes us a member of the moral community? And then the next stage in that would be, once we're satisfied that we've answered that question, we then see whether animals, some animals, all animals also have that feature, which would then bring them into the same moral community as us, and then they would be deserving of the same treatment as us. And you go backwards and forwards with this. So there's a type of utilitarian tradition, and Bentham expresses this very well, that what matters is not whether animals can reason, but whether they can suffer. And on that view, if you're capable of pleasure and pain, then you're a member of a moral community with the same standing as anyone else, or any other creature or object that can feel pleasure and pain. So there's one enormous moral community. And if we think probably all animals actually can feel pain, or at least any animal with a nervous system can feel pain, then the moral community is vast. Then there's a type of neo-Kantian, even Kantian tradition that says that what matters is something about autonomy or reason or some type of higher cognitive ability. And then on that view, we leave out many animals, although it would be debatable where we draw the line. So the higher apes, dolphins probably in, who knows about pigs and dogs, but there would be some way of drawing a line. The trouble with that is often said it leaves out some human beings as well. And so we have this impasse where we go backwards and forwards. And when I started this and was reading some of the literature on animal rights, animal experiments, it seemed that people felt they had to solve that problem first. What is it that makes us special, and see if it extends to animals. But what I realized is that this is, and this presents itself as a rather sophisticated position. But the problem is that then it has this very sharp divide between who's in the community and who's out of the community. And if you take that view, then there's a question, well, what do we do about those that are outside the moral community? Can we treat them just as we want? So if we decide it's higher level cognition and most animals don't have it, then why do we even care about pain for those animals? So it seems to draw far too stark a line. So what I did instead was say, let's stop thinking about where do we draw the line, as if there's one line, and instead start thinking about what I call in the book morally relevant properties and morally relevant characteristics. And so the view is, if a creature is capable of pain, then feeling pain, then at the very least you should take that into account in how you deal with the creature. If the creature is capable of a rich social life, then you should take that into account. So in other words, you should respond to the features of different animals. So I'm not saying any of these characteristics generate a right not to be treated. They could do if they're serious enough. But the general approach is to say we've just got to put lots of different factors in the balance and try to think of working our way through that, rather than thinking there's a cut-off property and everything on one side deserves one type of treatment, everything on the other side deserves another type of treatment.
And that's difficult coming from a philosophical tradition, in that the methods and conclusions tend to be much more black and white in philosophy, but I think you were hinting in the book that working in policy or thinking about policy helped you to develop a more nuanced approach with an ability to compromise.
I think one of the things that strikes you quite early on when you're thinking about making policy recommendations is that, like it or not, there's always a type of status quo bias. That is, you start from where you are. You might not like being where you are. You may wish that wasn't even on the table, but everything you're doing is about recommending changes, and there, changes can have unintended effects. So moving from an undesirable status quo to what you might think is a more desirable alternative position could actually have negative effects in other ways. So if you think about the regulation of recreational drugs, if you were going to come up with a regime for regulating recreational drugs, no one could possibly have come up with what we've got now.
Yeah.
I mean, no one would put ecstasy in the same category as heroin, for example. And if you look at tobacco and alcohol, they cause more serious harms than most illegal drugs. So if you had any type of principled or reasonable view, you wouldn't come up with what we've got. So for philosophers, you can look at this and look at the evidence and think, my God, what have we done? This is ridiculous. But that's not the question. It's not how ridiculous is it what we've got. The question is, what would happen if we tried to change what we've got?
Right.
And that's a completely different question, because there's a type of path dependence from where we are. So I think that is one of the more difficult things for philosophers to just switch their mindset to be thinking in that much more pragmatic, practical mode.
Thank you. My second question was about drug policy, so I won't ask that, and I'm just conscious of the time. There's so many people in the audience. I'm even seeing Professor Aileen Kavanagh, who was formerly in the School of Law in Oxford. So I'm conscious there'll be lots of questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end. But I will at this point then bring Adina Preda in. So Professor Preda is an Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy in Trinity College, Dublin, and has a number of questions, having read your book. So go ahead, Adina, whenever you're ready.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Donna. Hi, Joe. It's great to have you here. Welcome to Trinity, so to speak. I hope it's not too long before we can welcome you in person. Great book to discuss on World Book Day, by the way. I think everyone can learn from it. And especially the new chapters, which I really enjoyed, especially on the future of work and poverty, really interesting stuff. But I will mainly, I think, ask you about things that you haven't said in the book. I'm sure you will enjoy that. I have about 327 questions, so I'll ask 2 or 3 of those. I think I'll start with the area that is perhaps at the forefront of almost everybody's thought at the moment, and that's health, of course. The chapter in the book focuses on social inequalities on health and the social gradient in health. And the main lesson there, I gather, is that governments, if they want to reduce the social inequalities, should focus on the care. So what I'm wondering is, if, for example, tomorrow, rather than the unit of liquor, gambling, and data protection called, it was Matt Hancock's office, who said, Professor Wolff, we've read your work, including, for instance, the paper you wrote on how should governments respond to the social determinants of health, but we're now in a pandemic. We think this might have additional impact on health inequalities. What would you advise? I mean, I do expect one thing you would advise is that we don't know enough and we need more money for research. But apart from that, if there is anything.
Yeah. Well, the tempting thing, of course, is to say, well, my first bit of advice is we don't start from here, and that we should have been doing different things for the last 20 years. But unfortunately, that is not the option we have. So how can we? Yeah. so there are various levels in thinking about health. So I think when most people think about health, as you indicate, I think normally we think about healthcare. So thinking about COVID, we're all thinking about the vaccines at the moment, and we're thinking about are there going to be better therapeutics? So we're thinking at that very practical end of health is delivered by people in white coats in institutional settings, roughly speaking. But of course, as many people, Michael Marmot is one of a lot of people who said this, Richard Wilkinson, the healthcare system is like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And the thing we have to do is stop people falling off the cliff. And if you think about the different levels of success in dealing with a pandemic, it's really extraordinary that healthcare has had until we get the vaccine, until we begin to see the effects of the vaccine, healthcare has had so little effect. So if we think about Vietnam, for example, that have been so successful, they just used very old-fashioned techniques of public health. That when you've got an infectious disease, lock everyone in their house until the infectious disease goes away, roughly speaking, and make sure they have food. And so those are public health measures rather than healthcare measures. And what's fascinating to me is that the countries with the most advanced healthcare were the most blasé about public health, because they felt that they could deal with anything that they had coming to them. So I think the US and the UK, we were told we have the best modelers, we have the best vaccines, we have the best doctors. So therefore we don't have to do very much because the healthcare system can take care of everything. And of course it can't, and it was completely overwhelmed. So investing in ordinary public health is one thing, and that is part of the social determinants of health. But going even deeper than that, we think about who has been more susceptible to death and infection. And this is something I have been looking at. So with Adina Dishali, we've just finished a paper. Of course, everything is out of date as soon as it's written now, but looking at data just from a few months ago, and these things are very well known that in the US and the UK, there's a big ethnic division in who's more susceptible and who is more likely to die. And we've looked at this, and it's very hard to explain in ordinary ways. So you might think people from ethnic minorities are more likely to be doing essential work, such as care work or driving buses, living in more crowded accommodation and so on. So those ordinary public health factors, but that can't explain everything. And I went to a talk a month or two ago by someone who is an expert on biological and chronological aging, who was suggesting there is evidence that if you are subject to racism throughout your life, then you age faster, biologically age faster. And this can be detected medically, which would then be fascinating, because as we think of the pandemic as particularly affecting older people, then people from ethnic minorities get older faster. And so the age profile, well, now she didn't say that explains everything, but we can start putting this picture together. And so we can start thinking about what is it about our society that makes some people so much more susceptible to illness than others. And mostly it's the ordinary things. It's about poverty, it's about inequality, it's about people living in overcrowded accommodation, people doing damaging jobs that damage their health. But we also, I think, now we understand that being subject to discrimination is bad for your health in this very physical way. And I think this is something that hasn't been fully appreciated. It makes everything much more complicated, of course, because it's not within Matt Hancock's brief to eliminate discrimination. So that's why I wrote that paper years ago. I went to a seminar at the LSE, and there was someone from the Department of Health. And I went out for a drink with him afterwards, and I started explaining the social determinants of health to him, and he just yawned and said, we know all this. We had Michael Marmot in last week. We've read all the stuff, but we don't know what to do about it. That is, if you're in the Department of Health, then the levers of health aren't within your brief. So what can you do? Now, one of the things I'm very keen on is think about the relation between stress and health, and thinking about the ways in which government increases chronic stress in people's lives. So the sense in which having to deal with the bureaucracy of government makes people ill physically. And this is not a metaphor, it actually literally makes people ill. Another talk I went to recently, someone argued that of people involved in legal cases, whether it's whichever side they're on, whether it's civil or criminal, about 25% report that their health has deteriorated as a result of being part of legal proceedings. And you know this from friends and family, that if anyone has a law case, it's really bad for them. So if you think about the mundane ways in which our bureaucracy and our systems are creating pressures that cause people illness, I think we can do a lot of good. So even simple things, and to its credit, the UK government has done this, redesigning websites, Gov.uk websites, so they're simple to navigate. You know, compared to how they were 10 years ago, they're a miracle. And you know, I'm not saying they save lives, but they could be reducing stress and not only helping people engage with that material, but having other better effects. So I would say for the government, the first thing we need to do is a stress audit of the government and the way in which governments are putting unnecessary chronic, not acute stress, which is different, but unnecessary chronic stress into people's lives.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I thought there was more to that.
Well, I do have more, but I could answer.
Sure, there is, yes, but yeah, I mean, this kind of brings me to almost two other questions that I'll try and compress together, if you wish. One is whether you think there are conflicts between recommendations you might make in different areas, given that you don't want an overall theory that's going to tell you what's to be done overall. And this links in with the chapter on disability, when one of the lessons we learned there is that we can't sort of hope for equality, the kind of equality that we would really like in theory, and the best, in a sense, we can hope for in the medium and short term is a pragmatic approach, you call it, where certain features should not add to inequalities. I wonder if you can expand on that, in particular in relation to the things you didn't discuss, which I assume will be in future editions, such as race and gender. Yeah. What would a pragmatic approach imply there, and what might this imply for other areas, if anything?
Okay, very good. So so that was one of the least comfortable things, I think, in the book, of having this sort of pragmatic recommendations around disability. But I just want to say something about another inconsistency, because it goes back to a comparison with the chapter on animal experimentation that we were talking about early on with Donna. Because one of the things I came to realize after I'd written the first edition was that there's a type of tension between what I say around animal experimentation and disability, roughly speaking, which is when you're talking about humans in relation to animals, it seems quite important not to have a bright line between animals and humans, to say all humans are on one side, all animals are on the other. And you want to emphasize a type, maybe evolutionary gradation or some other continuum. But when we talk about disability, and particularly cognitive disability, the temptation is to start talking about a common humanity, and that all human beings are part of this, members of the same species, and deserve the same treatment because we're part of a common humanity. So around disability, we want to huddle all human beings together and say we all deserve the same treatment. Whereas in relation to animals, we tend to want to say there's more of a gradation and less of a bright line. And this has been a problem. So Eva Kitte, for example, has debated with Peter Singer and with Jeff McMahon, very publicly, about how they want to degrade people with disabilities to the level of animals, whereas they would say, no, I'm trying to promote animals to the level of human beings. So there is a type of that's a philosophical clash rather than a practical clash, but it does worry me, and I still don't feel I've got a completely satisfactory answer to dealing with that. So if you're thinking both about disability and human relation to animals, you've got a problem there that you need to think about how to deal with it. But in terms of the pragmatics, so sometimes when I write about disability, I'm at my most ideal of ideal theory. So yeah, in a lot of my work, I've been very pragmatic, non-ideal or real world theory. But I have found it helpful thinking disability to ask a question. Well, let me say how this arises. So some years ago, I mean, many years ago, I was trying to explain John Rawls's approach to disability to one of my colleagues at UCL, Arnie Zuboff, who was not a brilliant philosopher, but hadn't really grappled with Rawls on political philosophy. And I can't remember why it came up, but I said to him, you know, Rawls talks about primary goods, income and wealth. He deliberately leaves out issues of health and disability. He abstracts away from that. So Arnie says, yeah, gee, why does he do that? And I said, well, he wrote this paper where he said, first of all, he wants to get clear on the central cases before we look at these other marginal cases. And Arnie said, well, gee, you know, why would he not think disability was the central case? Right? I thought, well, this is really fascinating. And what would political philosophy be like if we started from thinking, you know, everyone has to be an equal from the start, rather than doing the Rawlsian thing of starting, okay, we've got this core group of able-bodied adults within the normal range of health, let's get justice right for them and fit things around the edges. So what I realized, both in philosophy and in real life, we tend to fit disability around the edges. That is, we do design for the 95% or the 90% or the 80% or whatever it turns out to be, and then try to think, how can we modify what we want so more people can fit in? So in some moods, I like to think, well, let's think the other way. How would we have designed buildings knowing that people have different types of mobility? How would we have designed the internet from the start, knowing people, not everyone can see, not everyone can hear? So how can we do this type of inclusive design? So I think as a type of thought experiment, that is really important to do. And I think it's really important for disability activists to keep reminding us of this stuff and not being happy with a pragmatic approach. But again, you know, we're not starting from nowhere. We're starting from where we are. We've built the buildings we built. We've got the institutions we have. So our question is, how can we make things better for many more people? And in the book, I do take you're right, I take quite a low standard, and as I said, I'm uncomfortable about this, which is, how do we make sure the world isn't worse for people with disabilities in virtue of their disability, rather than thinking about what would equality be? And you know, who knows, if I do a third edition, maybe I'll try and be a bit more ambitious. But we've got this general problem, which I looked at more in my work on disadvantage, about there are so many different claims of justice. There's so many ways in which the world is unjust. Where do we start, right? Which are the most urgent? Well, to some degree, you know, it's obvious that some needs are more urgent than others, but there are many calls for resources. And until very recently, until this last year, I always thought resources were limited. I now think I might be quite naive about that, because the government seems to be able to get resources whenever it needs to. And so maybe I have to rethink the economic assumptions around scarcity. But if we stay in our normal paradigm that things have an opportunity cost, doing things in one area has an opportunity cost, and that is really the hardest question in ethics and public policy.
Yes, I mean, sorry, did you want to come in, Donna?
No, I think it was just an echo. Go ahead.
Oh, right. Yeah, the reason why that question came to my mind is because I think, for instance, here in Ireland, we have quite a big issue at the moment with some of those potential conflicts, right? So if you recommend, for example, that governments look at the causes of stress, that might mean, for instance, you might want to allow people to stay in their, to stay in their homes where they've lived all their lives and so on, even though that in Ireland, in Dublin in particular, means an exacerbation of the current housing crisis, which of course is a massive cause of stress for a number of other people. And so on. But I won't ask you to solve that problem as well. For my last question, do I still have time, Donna, or do you want me to
There's
wrap up?
a little bit of time, so maybe Joe could answer it briefly, if that's okay, and then I'll bring Robert. Yeah?
Okay, so let me just kind of a more challenging question in a way. Well, it's not that challenging. I'm refraining from pointing out why you're wrong. All that. You end this chapter in the book, and of course you have a final chapter on lessons for philosophy, right? Conclusions. And the big lesson, I take it, is that public policy does not need philosophy, as you put it, by which I take it you mean doesn't need grand theorizing, grand not in the Irish sense, but in the regular sense. But it does need philosophers. So the question I have here, in a sense, which I kind of know the answer to, but I would like to hear it again, I think, is philosophers do need philosophy, I would suggest. Of course, you're not saying, in fact, you do say explicitly that you would like other areas of philosophy to be represented. You would like people to do research, even in ideal theory, and of course, other areas of philosophy and of course other disciplines. But I'm still a little concerned that someone who is reading this book and maybe knows some of your other work might come away with the impression that they perhaps don't need to, let's say, if they're public policy makers, they don't need to fund certain areas, or if they're students who do want to do engaged philosophy, they may not need to study certain areas. Even, you know, John Stuart Mill, you say, turns out he's useless. So could you sort of give us an argument now as to why these esoteric areas should be funded and studied, even by those of us who would like to be more engaged, perhaps?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I would hate to have given the impression that I'm saying defund philosophy.
I know, yes.
But on the other hand, you know, applying for grants is a nuisance. So if there are other ways of doing it without big funding, maybe that's better. No, so what I would just want to really make a distinction between the pragmatics of everyday policy making and thinking about what might happen in the course of the next 2 years, and you know, the longer term. So, you know, when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she wasn't feeding into a parliamentary inquiry. She was writing pure, you know, a work of pure philosophy that was probably ridiculed at the time. Took a long time to have any influence, maybe more than 100 years before it had any effect. But certainly people did look at it later on. When I think, for example, of Robert Nozick, who I studied when I was an undergraduate, at that time, these libertarian ideas were just seemed to be ridiculous, laughable. You know, 25 years later, they're sort of mainstream. So, and having damaging effects on policy around the world, in my view. So I do think that, that there's a quick dynamic and a slow dynamic. And for the quick dynamic, where we're making decisions soon, then I think grand theory, new grand theory or applying grand theory is not constructive. But even in that day-to-day policy making, you are using values and arguments that have been created in previous generations. So you're drawing on a store. There's a type of stock of ideas, and you know, philosophers are replenishing that stock of ideas, and we need it for a vibrant public culture. So we need that slow dynamic, even if in the heat, well, not that hot, but the heat of the committee, you're not going to be, you know, taking utilitarianism or raw utilitarianism and saying, okay, I've got the theory, let's work out the answer. So you can't use philosophical theory in the way that some economists use, you know, the Treasury Green Book or cost-benefit analysis, but you are still drawing on these values that have been developed over the decades and centuries within philosophical theory. So there is a role. It's just a question of understanding the place.
Thanks so much, Professor Preda, and thank you so much for your answers, Joe. So in the same vein then, on the question of methodology, I suppose I'll hand over to Dr. Noonan, who has a few questions on your methodological framework and approach.
Thanks very much, Donna, for that, and thanks, Professor Wolff, for the really interesting discussion that we've had between yourself and Professor Preda on this. And I wanted to start off by saying that I think a really important contribution of the book is kind of reclaiming or reaffirming philosophy as a public value, so not something that just happens in sort of academic or ivory tower contexts, but it's something that kind of bears on and contributes to civic and public life in a really important way. And I think that that's you know, a kind of maybe more classical-ish kind of view of philosophy, but I think a really, really important one as well, that it's not just intellectual game playing or puzzles or playing chess like that Daniel Dennett wrote about. So I think that that's a really, really important contribution. And I think that the way I kind of looked at it was that you're attentive to this problem that academic philosophy and public policy theorizing or public policy debate are very different domains that have these different constraints on them. So in public policy, as you mentioned, things are very, you have to deal with path dependence. So minor tweaks that might have addressed problems in the past spin out and they might actually cause problems in the future, but you have the system you have. And ideal theorizing or in this kind of domain of pure reason and philosophy, philosophers don't have to deal with that sort of problem. And you need consensus to change that as well. So you're also critical, I think, of maybe social norms in philosophy that incentivize philosophers to disagree more than they agree, or to be maybe a little bit more truculent or combative with one another's theories in the name of searching for the truth in that way that philosophers do. So the question, I kind of looked at then, the question is, how do philosophers transfer between these domains? What kind of, how do they bridge these gaps? And I think that you'd seem to be kind of skeptical that the substantive propositions from academic theorizing, because they come from this kind of idealized theorizing, that they would be necessarily useful because they have this top-down sort of theory construction, or they have a very world to theory direction of fit. So the world has to adapt to your theory, and the bits of the world that don't work will just junk them because they're obviously wrong. And so that's not good because of it ignores the path dependency problem, and it's not really apt to generate consensus. So I was kind of thinking then, well, what else do philosophers bring to the table then to justify their contribution to public policy debate? And I was kind of thinking about sort of method, and maybe social and epistemic norms in philosophy might be the more promising candidates there. So I think that you kind of do say that philosophers, you know, we've this penchant for conceptual analysis, like argumentative rigor, critical self-reflection on your own presumptions. I think those are good things that the philosophy kind of instills, right? And there's those negative kind of social values as well around kind of competitiveness or promoting disagreement. So I wonder, like, are those epistemic or kind of community values maybe something that philosophers bring in terms of a certain attitude towards truth seeking, or the way that philosophers argue? But that's not unique to philosophers, is another thing that you do say. So it's kind of a matter of degree, right? So is that the main thing that you think the philosophers kind of bring?
So I mean, it is a big challenge for me, actually, to try to explain what it is that philosophers bring, because as you say, I think that there are many people who are not philosophers who have similar talents to people who are trained as philosophers. So when I did the first edition of the book, one of my students at the time was from Singapore. She was a civil servant in Singapore, and she read through the draft and she came to me looking a bit disappointed, saying that as a civil servant, she does pretty much everything I say only philosophers can do. I thought, well, actually, that's probably right, and journalists and people in other academic disciplines do things that are very similar to us. But you know, and I know a lot of other philosophers have been pondering this. I recently read, Peter Singer was mentioned earlier. I recently read something quoting him where he said more or less what I said, although he said it 20 years before, which is that, yes, other people can do this, but we're paid to do it all day long. So we develop skills and picking things out, seeing patterns of argument, drawing distinctions. And there are things that are very simple to us that maybe won't attract the eye of everyone. So the first time I was involved in any of these policies was on a gambling law review. And a couple of conversations I had still stick in my mind from this. So on our very first meeting, the chair, who is very bright, very deep economist, Alan Budd, said, should we go around the table and just see who thinks gambling is wrong of all the people on the committee? And I immediately said, well, should we be asking that question? Or should we be asking the question about whether people think their view of whether gambling is right or wrong should have any bearing on what they recommend? And this is the sort of thing you might say in a graduate seminar or to third-year undergraduates. And it took me quite a long time just to explain the difference between thinking whether something was right or wrong and thinking about whether your view of whether it was right or wrong should have any bearing. So in other words, the idea of public reason. And so things that take us a long time maybe to grasp at first and then become second nature. And then a bit further on in that same meeting, there was someone who was a lawyer, part-time judge, in fact, who said, well, speaking as a lawyer, I think people ought to be able to do what they want in their own time with their own money, but there have to be limits. Yeah. So I said, well, that's very interesting. So do you think people should be able to do what they want, or do you think there should be limits? And she said, no, you misunderstand me. I think people should be able to do what they want, but there have to be limits, right? I thought, okay, I'm never going to get anywhere with this. So then you have to work out ways of approaching this instead of confronting people, instead of telling people that they've got something wrong, work out ways in which they can understand where you're coming from and see that that also is something they would agree to. So I was reminded in this episode about someone who defined diplomacy as the art of getting the other person to convince you of your point of view. And this is something you have to do a lot on committees. If you start taking credit for anything, you're lost. So you have to find ways of spreading the credit around the table so other people can think that they've made a contribution. And only you know what you're doing. But that's not particularly a skill as a philosopher. That's a skill as a diplomat and manipulator of people, I suppose. But the skill as a philosopher is taking what could be, the first skill is taking what could be a very heated public debate and trying to work out what is actually behind it. What is the difference? Because very often debates get very polarized. People talk in terms of slogans, they put things on their badges and their banners, and those don't necessarily reflect the subtlety of the position they really have. So people have, so I'm not saying people don't have a subtle position, they do, and they have strong intuitions that reflect a subtlety, but very often when they try to summarize their position, they don't capture the full depth of it. So one thing all academics can do, but philosophers are trained to do, is to try to bring that out. So that's the starting point of all of these debates. Why are people worried about this right now? And try to get as accurate a representation as you can of the dilemma, and then start working on possible solutions to it.
Yeah, sorry, Donna. No, I very much agree with that. I think that there's I sometimes wonder if there's a public perception of philosophy as being directed towards certain questions, but there's not as much of a focus on the methods of philosophy as being geared towards kind of an antidote to unclear thinking. Or now I think that the worst form of this is you kind of get a sense of pedantry or kind of getting bogged down in these ever more internecine distinctions. But I think that philosophers are very practiced at this. There's a lot of distinctions that philosophers very carefully draw, as you've pointed out, and I think that is it's not a completely unique starting point, but in the way that you characterized it as kind of a difference of degree between philosophers and other academics or other professionals involved in policy setting, I think the philosophers kind of do have some kind of competitive advantage, even if I know your case is actually quite modest, I think, for the involvement of philosophers. And so you wouldn't want people getting kind of too, I suppose, dogmatic about their philosophical views in these things, which isn't always constructive. But I think that the key point maybe is that the social norms around philosophy and the graduate seminars being maybe a little bit more kind of combative or disagreement focused. If philosophers can retrain their minds on that, but then apply the same argumentative skills that they are so well trained in applying, then that can actually be really fruitful. So yeah, it's something that Aristotle already did in the prior analytics and the rhetoric. These things are distinct, the art of persuasion as opposed to valid argument.
So I've been thinking lately about the distinction between how you train people and how they use what you train them with. And it may be a bit of a strained analogy, but I think about military training. So in military training, you know, people have to go around a obstacle course, and they're taught how to climb over something and under something, and they go round and round at a time, and they're trained to go around that obstacle course. But of course, they'll never on the battlefield have to go around an obstacle course. That's a way of developing skills that you can then go on to use elsewhere. And I think that, you know, a lot of what we do on our undergraduate training is like the obstacle course. But unfortunately, sometimes it becomes a type of end in itself without people realizing that you're developing these skills so you can deploy them in other contexts. So we tend just to build more and more complicated obstacle courses rather than thinking about, you know, taking what we've done and using it elsewhere, or at least in some cases. But I think this is changing. And one of the extraordinary things about the pandemic is a number of academics, including philosophers, that have been pulled into public service right now to think about things like vaccine distribution and prioritization. So it's really, I think the world is beginning to understand that there is some value in the sorts of works, particularly around bioethics, that they may have been rather sniffy, people have been sniffy about before.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the questions, Robert, and for your fascinating answers, Joe. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A box from Donal Lyons. Donal was formerly a lecturer in Trinity in maths, physics and statistics. Do you want to ask your question directly? I'll promote you to panelist, but if you prefer me to just read it out, I will. There you are. If you, you're there. Yeah, do you want to ask? Okay. Yeah.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
This is going way back to very abstract ideas. Derek Parfit, Persons and Reasons. Okay, so what do you think of that line of thought in general, and how would you apply it to, say, you know, a super AI that had feelings but lived in a machine, or maybe lived in a robot, or maybe a human consciousness, a genuine human uploaded onto a chip, or, you know, an intelligent, moral alien species? So theory behind all of that.
Okay. Well, so I've been talking about this topic for a long time, and I don't think anyone has ever asked me to comment on Parfit, on Reasons and Persons before. So, well, it was a book that came out when I was a graduate student, I think, and one of the most brilliant books in philosophy of the 20th century, probably. That he created, or, well, not created, but he certainly gave a lot of weight to population ethics in there. But you're more interested in the things he says about personal identity in the teletransporter.
Yes, I'm thinking about it. I mean, you can think of it as an animal. Why you know, an animal feels pain, you mentioned. So it's that sort of line that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to chicken out of this because it's not something I've given much thought.
Absolutely.
At this point.
Send me an email.
We'll follow up by email afterwards. Yeah.
So they haven't asked me to sit on that committee about chips transplanted into human beings yet, but no doubt it will come at some point.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Donal. And I'm going to bring in Aileen Kavanagh here, who is Professor of Constitutional Governance in the School of Law in Trinity College, Dublin, and formerly was a lecturer with Oxford. You can correct me if I got any of that wrong, Aileen, but go ahead whenever you're ready. You just need to unmute. I'm not sure you, yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I think I'll just start my video here.
There you go.
So welcome Jonathan to Trinity. I'm in a weird situation because I'm physically in Oxford, but Donna, my heart is in Dublin and Adina, so you know that. So fascinating discussion, and it's very close to my heart because I work in constitutional theory, which really is at that interface, I think, between theory and practice, how it is in the real world, as well as thinking deeply about that. Now, one way of looking at this interface is to think that we do the theory first, and then we apply that theory to the practice. And I detect this approach sometimes in philosophy departments and sometimes in law schools as well. In other words, a perception that the abstract theory is the high road, and then you've got to get down and dirty with the messy business of real life, and then you can sometimes just put your hands up and say it's too messy, it doesn't, you know, I can't apply my abstract theory here because it's just too disparate. And yeah, I think that is sometimes true, and I wonder what you think of that approach. But I tend to think of it not as the theory applied to the practice, but looking at the practice in a certain way to see what insights that practice yields. That is what I feel I'm doing when I work in constitutional theory. So if you like, some of this discussion has been about what philosophy brings to public policy. But my question to you is, do you have a sense that public policy brings something to your philosophy? I don't mean just that it's interesting problems to think about, but that the real world, and I say that without inverted commas, that the real world is yielding insights, philosophical insights.
Okay, well, thanks so much. If I had planted a question, it would have been that one. So thank you so much for that question. A few years ago, a friend of mine, Annabelle Lever, was editing a handbook on ethics and public policy, and someone let her down on a methodology chapter. Someone was ill and couldn't write it, so she had a missing chapter and asked me if in a few weeks I could write a chapter on methodology. And I've always tried to avoid writing on methodology because I'd rather do stuff than write about methodology. But I thought, well, I'll take the opportunity because I'll get it off my chest and I'll never have to talk about it again. But it seems that all I've done since is talk about methodology. But what I do in that chapter is distinguish what I call applied philosophy, which is where you start with a theory and try to apply it to the real world, and you get all sorts of problems, with what I call that engaged philosophy, which is where you start from the problem. I'm not claiming to have invented this, I learned it from other people, but I think one of the things that happens is philosophers tend to talk applied, but act engaged. That is, that it never really works. I mean, when I first started reading medical ethics, I'd read these papers, often not by philosophers, say, here's a problem, this is what a utilitarian would say, this is what a Kantian would say, this is what a rule utilitarian would say, then maybe sometimes this is what a virtue ethics theorist or a natural law theorist would say, and in conclusion, this is what the utilitarian would say, this is what the Kantian would say, right? And never get anywhere, which was incredibly frustrating. But now we've moved on and we start with a problem. So the problem could be, you know, to take something that was discussed a lot a few years ago, I've not written about this, say the amputation of healthy limbs, where people were wanting to have elective surgery to remove a healthy limb. Now you could do a utilitarian would say, a Kantian would say, but the much more interesting thing is say, well, why does anyone want to do this? What's driving them? Yeah. What are the reasons? Why would a surgeon? What would a surgeon think if they're asked? What are the professional codes around it? So you start looking in the details, and from there you realize some values are relevant and others aren't. So you bring the fragments of theory in as they're relevant. So you begin with the problem. Instead of thinking, I've got the solution to whatever you've got, just give me the problem, I've already got the solution. You start with the problem and see where you go. Now, how does that enrich you? Well, going back, my best example of this is with disability. So when I started working on disability, it was treated in philosophy as a question of distributive justice. Roughly speaking, how much more money should we give to people who had disabilities? Then when I started doing some work on the topic and started talking to people in disability studies and reading things from disability activists and disability policy, of course, some people with disabilities are in poverty and need more money, or they have higher expenses and need more money. But the idea that you're going to be compensated with money for your disability was considered like a sort of hideous thought, whereas that was type of cutting edge political philosophy. It was humiliating to think you need compensation for disability. So what I realized, I know we're running short of time, so I'll finish quickly. We just had the wrong concepts in philosophy. So we needed to take the concepts from disability studies and disability activists and try to build more of, if we're going to do theory, build our theories on the concepts that come from the world, rather than thinking that we can do it out of our heads. Because most people at that time, I'm going back to the 80s, most people who'd written about disability just hadn't read anything outside philosophy. They were just thinking, you know, we're the smartest people in the room, the philosophers, so we don't need to read anything else. They came up with what I think are terrible theories, philosophically terrible theories, and people with no philosophical training were coming up with philosophically better theories than people who were earning their living as philosophers. So yes, I completely agree with you, Aileen.
Thanks so much, Professor Kavanagh. Thanks so much for that response. And there are only 2 questions left in the Q&A box, so I'll just read them out if you don't mind, Sean and anonymous attendee. We just don't have time to do the videos for these at this stage, but I'll read them out. Sean Darcy asks, does Professor Wolff think that philosophers generally spend sufficient time publicly explaining the importance of the subject and its application to helping us to have better society, understanding each other more, to have a better society and understanding each other more, etc. And then an anonymous attendee asks or says it would be very much appreciated if you were able to share a reference to the study or research regarding 25% of those engaged in legal process experience chronic stress. We'd all love to be able to cite that. So feel free to send that to me afterwards. No need to have it on the tip of your tongue.
So on the reference, I hadn't come prepared with that in my head. So we can not even
on later.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look that up, but it's very important, I think, and needs to be better known. So philosophy and public culture is a really interesting issue, and that in the UK definitely it comes and goes, and at the moment it's not in a strong position. So, you know, when I was growing up, we had Brian McGee on television doing his Men of Ideas programs. The previous year had you know, radio programs with you know, regular appearances of philosophers like Bertrand Russell or A.J. Ayer. I think it's quite hard now to think of many philosophers who are even in the public eye in the UK. A.C. Grayling was for a while, but since Brexit, he seems to have faded away a bit, and he's got his new College for the Humanities. So I think, you know, I don't know who the media even go to for philosophers now if they want one. People like Nigel Warburton and Julian Baggini as more public philosophers are doing a lot, but it's not a great time for philosophers in the public eye. I mean, if you think about Mary Warnock, for example, Honora O'Neill for a while, though less now. I don't know why that is. Michael Sandel seems to be the philosopher that gets the attention, but of course he's in the US. So yeah, we could do more. I think it is difficult because, you know, most of us who went into philosophy did it because we couldn't do anything else. You know, if we could have been on TV or on the radio, we would have done that instead. But we're just really good with books. So that, you know, one thing sitting on the committees, understanding the difference between an academic and a journalist was fantastic. So if there's an area I needed to know about, my instinct would be to, at that time, to go to the library or do a Google search and spend a month looking for things. The journalist would do a Google search to find the name of someone to phone up and just phone them up. I thought that is the big difference in temperament. There are those of us who are comfortable doing our own research, those who just want to find things out and will do it as quickly as possible and have the courage just to go on the phone. If someone phones you up and asks you, you're quite pleased to tell them. It's not a, it's quite an honor almost to be phoned up by journalists to be asked things. So I think most of us just have the wrong temperament to do it, and that is a problem. There are a few people who do more than others. But this would be my final tip. If you want a tip from me, you didn't ask for a tip. Anyway, I'll give you my final tip is talk to people from other disciplines as much as you can. So if you're working in an area, don't think you can do it by your own research, because what we tend to forget is other disciplines are just as controversial as ours. And so if you just go to the library or Google something and read the most cited paper, that's only going to be one contribution. You think you've done your research, but you've seen a fragment of a debate. So what you need to do is find someone who's in that debate who can explain to you what is considered as settled and what's still controversial. Imagine someone trying to find out what moral philosophy is and going to Philosophy and Public Affairs and just reading the most cited paper from last year and thinking, I've now got the philosopher's position on something. We would laugh, but that's what we do when we go to other disciplines. So we need to find those people and to pick their brains as much as we can.
Thank you so much, and we don't want to keep you over time. So just to thank you again immensely, Professor Wolff, for discussing these issues with us today. They've been fascinating. Thanks also to Professor Adina Preda, Dr. Robert Noonan, and thank you so much, Professor Kavanagh also, and everybody who asked fascinating questions and really got the debate going. So Joe, you're such an influential thinker and a prolific scholar, and this book really touches on important issues relating to how we formulate and analyze public policy from an ethical and philosophical perspective in the modern era. So I really encourage everybody to read it. And I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with you today about this really important work. Is there anything else you'd like to raise before we wrap up? Otherwise, I'll close the session.
Just thank you, Donna and Adina and Robert and everyone who asked questions. So I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a very valuable occasion for me. So thanks so much for inviting me and hosting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone. See you again soon.
And thanks, Donna, for organising. Good to see you, Jonathan.
Bye.